Imagine for a second that you are standing in the middle of a city and it has completely burned to the ground.
Just total destruction.
Right. Politically, socially, culturally, it is just smoke and rubble. That is essentially France at the tail end of the revolution. Everything has been torn down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the monarchy is headless. The church is banned. The social hierarchy is just gone.
It's a blank slate, or a very messy one.
Exactly. And out of that smoke steps one man. He's not a king. Well, at least not yet. He's a soldier. And somehow he manages to grab the reins of this absolute chaos and ride it all the way to becoming the master of Europe.
It really is. It's one of history's most dramatic trajectories. But what makes it so fascinating to study isn't just the military conquests, though those are obviously huge.
Yeah.
It's what historians call the Napoleonic paradox.
Okay, let's unpack that immediately. The paradox being
That this one man, Napoleon Bonaparte, manages to simultaneously save the ideals of the French Revolution.
and completely destroy them at the same time.
Exactly. He's the hero who cements equality and meritocracy, and yet he's the villain who brings back authoritarianism, censorship, and basically creates the first modern police state.
So he's a walking contradiction, the ultimate, the end justifies the means kind of story. And today we're going to do a deep dive into exactly how he pulled this off.
It's a wild ride.
It really is.
Yeah.
We're looking at AP European History Topic 5.6 today, which covers his rise, his dominance, and his eventual defeat. But honestly, this feels less like a strict history lesson and more like a case study in power, media manipulation, and unintended consequences.
I completely agree. It's a masterclass in how to build an empire, and also a really stark warning on how quickly it can all collapse under the weight of your own ambition.
So let's go back to that smoke and rubble. The revolution has happened. The king is dead. But the source material notes that before Napoleon actually takes over, there's this government in place called the Directory. What is going on there? Why was the bar set so low that a general could just walk in and take over?
Well, by the late 1790s, the Directory was effectively running on fumes. To put it mildly, they were a disaster. It was a 5-man executive committee.
Which is already a recipe for deadlock.
Right, nothing gets done.
Right.
And they were plagued by massive corruption and inefficiency.
So just gridlock and graft.
Exactly. And for the average French citizen, life was still incredibly hard. You had hyperinflation making money virtually worthless, bread prices were skyrocketing again, and people were just exhausted.
They just wanted a break.
Yeah, they had lived through the terror, the guillotine, the constant wars. There was a massive power vacuum because the government had zero legitimacy left.
And nature and Napoleon abhors a vacuum.
Precisely. The public was desperate for stability. They didn't necessarily want a king back on the throne, but they definitely wanted the chaos to end. And here comes Napoleon. He rose to the rank of general in 1794. He's young, he's brilliant, and he has this glowing reputation from his campaigns in Italy.
Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting to me. The source material mentions his reputation, but it also hints at a little bit of, let's call it creative storytelling on his part.
Creative storytelling is a very polite way to put it. This is crucial to understanding him as a leader. We often think of Napoleon as this invincible general, and in many ways he was. But in 1798, he was in Egypt.
Right.
He was fighting the British to try and cut off their trade routes to India, and frankly, it was going poorly.
How poorly are we talking?
Well, the British Navy, led by Admiral Nelson, destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile. So Napoleon's army was trapped. They were winning battles on land, sure, but they were stranded.
But the people back in Paris didn't know that, right? I mean, they weren't getting live updates from the front lines.
No, not at all. Napoleon was a master of what we today would call PR or spin. He totally controlled the bulletins that were being sent back to France. Yeah, he highlighted the scientific discoveries his team was making, the exotic nature of the Orient, the victories on land. He completely obscured the fact that it was a strategic disaster.
So he basically curates his own feat to look like a winner.
He does. And then he does something that tells you everything you need to know about his ambition. He realizes that the political situation in Paris is ripe for a takeover. So he leaves his army in Egypt.
He left them there.
He literally ghosted his own army.
That is wild.
He slipped past the British blockade, rushed back to France before the bad news could really catch up to him, and capitalized on his image as a savior who had returned to fix the mess that the Directory created.
That is such a hustle. He essentially abandons a failing campaign to launch a coup at home.
Precisely, and this is the coup of 1799. He returns, finds the Directory weak and deeply unpopular, and with the help of some political allies, including his brother, he overthrows it.
Just like that.
Just like that. He establishes a new government called the Consulate with 3 members, and of course he names himself First Consul.
First consul. Which sounds very Roman, very man of the people. Like, I am just the first servant of the Republic.
It was entirely designed to look that way. It was a facade of republicanism, but the mask slipped pretty quickly. In 1799, he's first consul. By 1802, he makes himself consul for life.
A big step.
And by 1804, he decides the facade isn't necessary anymore. He crowns himself Emperor Napoleon I.
Talk about a pivot. You go from saying, I am fighting for the people's revolution, to I am the emperor in just 5 years.
Yeah.
How did he justify that to a public who just beheaded a king a decade earlier?
That's the genius of his argument. He claimed that a strong, singular ruler was the absolute only way to preserve the gains of the revolution.
Right.
He basically told the French people, look, if I'm not emperor, the old royal family, the Bourbons, they will come back. And if they come back, they'll take your land and bring back feudalism. You need me to be an emperor so that the monarchy doesn't return.
I have to destroy democracy to save the revolution.
In a nutshell, yes. And this brings us right to that paradox we mentioned earlier. Once he has this absolute power, he starts rolling out massive domestic reforms. We call it the Napoleonic Order. And we really have to give credit where it's due, because some of these things were genuinely revolutionary and modernized France in ways that we still see today.
So let's start with the good stuff, the modernization. Because he didn't just sit on a throne and eat grapes. He went to work and rewrote the rule book.
He literally rewrote the rule book. The most famous example is the Civil Code, often called the Napoleonic Code, which was established in 1804.
And before this, what was the legal system like?
France was a total mess of different legal customs. What was illegal in one town might be perfectly fine in the next town over. It was just feudal chaos. Napoleon standardized everything into one written code.
And this wasn't just about tidying up the paperwork. This had real social implications for everyday people. Right.
Huge implications. It legally guaranteed equality for all male citizens. It protected private property, which was a massive deal for the middle class who had bought up land during the Revolution. It got rid of the old idea that you were born into a certain legal status.
That connects to the bureaucracy changes, too, based on the sources. He shifted things to a meritocracy.
Yes, and this is one of his most enduring legacies. He completely dismantled the aristocratic privilege where you got a cozy government job or a military commission just because your dad was a duke. Under Napoleon, positions were awarded based on talent and ability.
Which is a very American dream kind of concept, planted right in the middle of 19th century Europe. If you're good at your job, you get promoted.
Exactly. And that's a huge reason why his army was so effective. It was led by people who actually knew how to fight, not just rich nobles. He also patched things up with the Pope, which was another major stabilization move.
That's the Concordat of 1801. Because the revolution had been pretty rough on the Catholic Church.
Rough is an understatement. The revolutionaries had seized church land, banned public worship, and even changed the calendar to get rid of Sundays.
Wow.
But Napoleon was a pragmatist. He knew that the vast majority of French people were still Catholic. He couldn't effectively rule a divided nation, so he made a deal. Catholics could worship freely again.
But there's a catch, isn't there? There's always a catch with Napoleon.
The catch was absolute control. He brought the church back, but he made sure it was subservient to the state. Napoleon kept the right to nominate bishops, and the state actually paid the clergy's salaries.
Oh, wow. So the priests were essentially on the government payroll.
Exactly. He used the pulpit to preach obedience to the emperor.
Smart. Keep your friends close and your priests on the payroll. Okay, so that's the modernizer Napoleon. We have equality before the law, meritocracy, religious peace, but we can't ignore the other side of the coin, the authoritarian Napoleon. Because for all this talk of equality, he was tightening the screws pretty hard on certain groups.
He was. And nowhere is the hypocrisy more obvious than in the status of women.
Yeah, the source material is pretty stark here. It says the status of women saw a sharp decline.
It was a massive step backward. During the earlier phases of the revolution, women had actually gained some significant rights regarding divorce and property ownership. Napoleon rolled all of that back. Under the Napoleonic Code, women were legally classified as dependents on their fathers or husbands.
Just entirely stripped of agency.
Yeah, they couldn't make legal contracts, they couldn't hold property in their own names.
So he codifies the idea that The husband is basically the emperor of the household.
That's a great way to put it. He wanted strict order in the state, and he wanted order in the home. And that deep desire for order extended to speech as well. Freedom of the press, which had been such a hallmark of the early revolution, was completely curtailed.
How bad did the censorship get?
Well, at one point, he shut down 60 of the 73 newspapers in Paris.
Just to wipe them out.
And for the ones that remained, he installed state censors right in their offices. If you wanted to print something, it had to be approved by the government first. Criticism of the regime was simply not allowed.
And if you did criticize him, or if you were even just suspected of it,
Then you had to deal with Joseph Fouché.
that name just sounds like a movie villain. Fouché.
He effectively was one. He was the minister of police, and he essentially created the first modern secret police force. His explicit job was the sniffing out of conspiracies. They were spying on everyday citizens, reading people's mail, and infiltrating social groups. People were executed just as a warning to others.
So on one hand, you have this grand idea of men are equal, you can get a job based on talent. And on the exact same hand, don't write that in the newspaper, don't speak out against the emperor, and women, you have absolutely no voice.
That is the Napoleon paradox, perfectly summarized. He used the brutal tools of a police state to enforce the ideals of liberalism. He genuinely believed that liberty was a luxury that could only exist if there was absolute order established first.
So that's what's happening inside France. But Napoleon wasn't content with just fixing France. He wanted the whole map. Looking at the source material, by 1810, he's basically the emperor of Europe.
If you look at a map from 1810, it is staggering. He built what was called the Grand Empire. And it's really important to understand the structure of this empire because it explains exactly why it eventually fell apart. It was built into 3 distinct tiers.
Walk us through those tiers.
First, you had the Grand Empire itself, this is France, plus the lands immediately around it that he annexed directly into France, like Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of Italy. These were ruled directly from Paris.
Okay, so that's direct control.
Then you had the satellite kingdoms. Now, these were technically independent countries, places like Spain, the Kingdom of Italy, or the Confederation of the Rhine over in Germany. But the kings of these countries were Napoleon's brothers, or his top generals.
The ultimate nepotism hire. Hey, Joseph, want to run Spain?
Exactly. He treated the thrones of Europe like party favors for his family members. And then the third tier were the Allied states. These were the major powers like Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Napoleon had defeated them in battle, so they were forced to be his allies and support his policies whether they wanted to or not.
So he's exporting this Napoleonic order everywhere he goes.
He is. And this is where it gets incredibly complicated for the people actually living in those countries. Because on one hand, he's a foreign conqueror. But on the other hand, when he takes over a region, he abolishes serfdom. He strips the local nobility of their special privileges. He implements the civil code.
So if you're a peasant in, say, a German state, Napoleon invading might actually be the best thing that ever happened to you. You suddenly have rights you never had before.
In the short term, yes. He was literally bringing the revolution to their doorstep. But he was also bringing the continental system.
Right, the economic war. Because there was one country he just couldn't beat on the battlefield.
Great Britain. He couldn't invade them across the Channel because the British Royal Navy was just too powerful, so he decided to bankrupt them instead. The continental system was a massive continent-wide blockade. He forbade any of his territories, grand, satellite, or allied, from trading with Britain.
The clear goal being to destroy the British economy.
Yes. But in reality, it completely backfired. Britain had global trade routes, they had colonies everywhere so they could survive. But Europe, they desperately relied on British manufactured goods and colonial imports. Suddenly, people on the continent couldn't get coffee, sugar, tobacco, or cheap cloth.
So he's liberating them politically, but he's starving them economically.
And that breeds massive resentment. People start asking, why are we suffering just to help France fight Britain? And this leads us to the beginning of the end. We often think of empires falling because of big dramatic battles, but here it really seems like it started with a feeling.
A feeling of, we are not French.
Precisely. This is the birth of modern nationalism, and it's the supreme irony of Napoleon's entire career. By occupying these countries and trying to force them into a French system, he inadvertently taught them to identify as a distinct people.
It backfired on him culturally.
Exactly. They stopped seeing themselves just as subjects of some distant king and started seeing themselves as Germans or Spaniards fighting a foreign oppressor.
And they didn't just feel it, they actually fought back.
Mm-hmm.
The outline mentions the guerrilla war in Spain. I didn't realize that term came from this exact era.
It does. It literally means little war in Spanish. In 1808, Napoleon tried to swap the King of Spain for his brother Joseph. The Spanish people, patriots, devout Catholics, everyday peasants, they completely refused to accept it. But they knew they couldn't fight his grand army head-on, so they used hit-and-run tactics. They ambushed supply lines, poisoned wells, and then just vanished into the hills.
It sounds like an absolute nightmare for a traditional marching army. You can't fight an enemy you can't find.
It was a bleeding ulcer, as Napoleon himself called it. It drained French resources and manpower constantly. And meanwhile, over in Germany, you had students and intellectuals organizing protests, celebrating German culture, and really laying the groundwork for a future unified Germany.
So the cracks are definitely forming. Spain is rebelling, Germany is angry, the economy is hurting everyone. And then Napoleon makes the classic historical blunder. He invades Russia.
The ultimate turning point, 1812. Russia had openly stopped complying with the continental system because it was just ruining their economy. Napoleon felt he had to punish them to maintain his authority. If he let Russia go, everyone else would just leave the blockade too.
So it was about ego and maintaining the integrity of the system.
It was about deterrence. So he assembles the Grande Armée.
And the numbers here are just hard to wrap your head around.
They are horrific. He marches into Russia with 600,000 men. It was the largest army ever assembled up to that point in history. But the Russians don't fight him directly. They know they can't beat him in a fair, open field fight, so they retreat.
And as they retreat, they use a very specific tactic, right?
The scorched earth policy. As the Russian army falls back, they systematically burn everything. Crops, barns, bridges, entire villages, even their own cities. They ensure that the French army has absolutely nothing to eat and nowhere to take shelter.
So the French army is just marching deeper and deeper into a frozen wasteland. They can't live off the land because there's literally no food left.
And then the Russian winter comes. Napoleon eventually reaches Moscow, but the city is empty and it's burning. He waits there for a surrender that just never comes. Finally, he's forced to order the retreat. And that retreat is one of the greatest tragedies in military history. You have mass starvation, freezing temperatures, and constant hit-and-run attacks from Russian Cossacks.
The source gives the final tally. 600,000 went in. How many came back?
Only about 40,000 effective soldiers returned.
40,000. That is a 93% casualty rate. He lost over 500,000 men.
It completely broke the back of his military power. He was never the same after that. And the rest of Europe knew it. They smelled blood in the water.
So the fall comes pretty quickly after that.
Very quickly. The failure in Russia left him totally vulnerable. In 1814, a unified coalition of European powers, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain, they capture Paris. Napoleon is forced to abdicate, and they exile him to the island of Elba, which is in the Mediterranean.
But he doesn't stay there. This is the part of the story that always feels like pure fiction to me. He's on an island, defeated, guarded, and he just escapes.
He does. This is the period famously known as the 100 Days. In 1815, he gets bored, slips off Elba, lands in the south of France, and just starts marching toward Paris. King Louis VIII sends an army to intercept and arrest him, and this really shows the sheer charisma of the man. Napoleon walks out entirely alone to meet the soldiers pointing guns at him, opens his coat, and says, "If any of you would shoot your emperor, do it now."
And instead of shooting him, they just join him.
They literally cheer Vive l'Empereur and switch sides on the spot. He reclaims power without firing a single shot. But as you can imagine, the rest of Europe wasn't going to let this slide a second time. They united immediately.
And this leads to the final showdown at Waterloo.
Waterloo, 1815. He faces the combined forces of the British and the Prussians, and he is decisively defeated. And this time, they don't send him to a nice, sunny Mediterranean island.
No, they definitely learned their lesson.
They sent him to St. Helena, which is a tiny, remote rock in the middle of the South Atlantic. Thousands of miles from anywhere. There was no escaping from there. He died in exile 6 years later.
So we've gone from the smoking rubble of the Revolution to the absolute height of the Grand Empire to a lonely death on an island in the Atlantic. When you step back and look at this whole arc based on our sources, what is the big takeaway? Because he really left behind such a mixed bag.
He really did. I think a synthesis here is that Napoleon was essentially a modernized tyrant. He created the blueprint for the modern state, the massive bureaucracy, the standardized legal codes, the meritocracy. These are systems that countries all over the world still use today. He proved definitively that competence matters more than bloodline.
What?
But his immense overreach and his ambition birthed the very force that tore his empire apart: nationalism. By trying to unite all of Europe under French rule, he actually made Europeans much more aware of their own national identities. And that nationalism would go on to shape the 19th and 20th centuries, causing wars and revolutions for decades to come.
It brings us right back to that central tension we started with. He claimed he needed absolute power to save the revolution, to save those ideals of liberty and equality from the surrounding monarchs who just wanted to crush them.
Right. And that's the truly provocative thought I'm left with. Napoleon argued that stability was the most important thing, even if it cost people their freedom. He saved the institutions of the revolution, but you could argue he killed the spirit of it. It really makes you wonder, does the preservation of ideals ever justify the destruction of the freedom those ideals represent?
Can you force people to be free? A heavy question that definitely didn't die with him on St. Helena. That's something for you to mull over. That's all for this deep dive into the Napoleonic paradox. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next one.